Welcome to the KIX EAP Podcast, your podcast with important leaders in education from Eastern Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, and the Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Ryan Allen, assistant professor at Soka University of America here in Orange County, California. My own background is in international and comparative education. Let's start the show. Today we have Tricia Wind, program leader for GPE KIX at the International Development Research Center. We talk about her path into the development world, how IDRC, KIX, and other stakeholders operate together, and pressing issues in the field. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. I know I certainly did, so let's jump to it. All right. Thank you for joining me today. I'm excited after meeting you at person in CIS, and now we have you here on the podcast. You have a background in international affairs, including an MA from Carleton University in the subject. Is this the kind of career space that you envision when you were starting out? Like how does one think about development as they're sort of coming up? And I see after your MA, you actually went to Tanzania. So that maybe is the stepping stone, or can you maybe talk about that experience?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe if I can just start, it's a pleasure to be on this podcast. It yeah, when when I think about how I did my university and how I moved into this, I feel like I was primarily just pursuing one interest at a time. I did a very broad interdisciplinary undergrad in one of Canada's sort of medium-sized universities. But it had a strong focus on research, and it also had a strong focus on international issues. That's the way that the course was structured. And in fact, in my very first year of university, I was in a research course that was primarily teaching students research skills, but it was all on topics broadly defined as international development. And interestingly, this was a long time ago when the nature of research meant that you actually had to spend a lot of time hunting for sources. It was back in the early 1990s, where actually, as a student, you would often submit your research questions to a librarian or keywords, and the librarian would have to call up on dial-up internet databases and find lists of sources, and then you would have to apply through interlibrary loan or periodical services to get the sources. And in my first year undergrad course on research skills applied to international development studies, the one of the databases that the librarians would search was the Library of the International Development Research Center. So I and my colleagues, who were very young at the time, were all talking about our IDRC searches and, what did you get and what did you find? And it was a really interesting source of Southern research on lots of different topics. So if I think about, how I ended up in this career, there was actually a little piece that started in first year undergrad. And so throughout my undergrad, I ended up often turning my papers into a focus on international development topics, whether or not they were on social issues or politics, but it was all pretty broad. And so when it came time to pick a master's degree, I still went with that focus and went to Carleton University, that's here in Ottawa in Canada, where I am living now, where they had a master's program in international affairs with a focus on development studies. So that ended up being the theme that I went through, but I have to say that at the time, I'm not sure that I had a really clear idea of what a career would look like. But it happened again after my first year of my master's, that when I was applying for summer jobs, I got a job at the International Development Research Center. And that was, going back to the IDRC searches, it was interesting to be in the building where that happened. And it turned into a really nice experience where I got to work with a great group of people. It was in their evaluation section, not in one of the programming sections, but the way that IDRC does evaluation is a very thoughtful, kind of research-oriented type of approach to evaluation, keyed into what are the learning questions that we have, or how do you measure things that are hard to measure. And so I ended up being able to be part of a productive, thoughtful little team within a nice organization like IDRC. So it happened that I got a summer job there, and then that turned into a couple of years worth of contracts and an internship. But then I paused and realized that I probably should get out of Canada. I had traveled quite a bit also for work, but we were able to spend 4 years in Tanzania in East Africa, and that was a marvelous experience to really be immersed in a different context, understand issues in a whole different way. Then came back to Ottawa, had a couple kids, and ended up, after working for NGOs, non-governmental organizations, for a time back at IDRC. And it's been since 2008 now, so it's been a long time.
Yeah, fantastic. You know what I love about that story is it starts with the library and the librarians. I have a soft spot for libraries. They're just such wonderful, sometimes underutilized, underfunded spaces. So I'm glad your origin story maybe started a little bit with the library. So that's wonderful to hear. So let's jump into your organizations and your position. So you're the program leader for Global Partnership Education KIX at IDRC, as you mentioned. And I think our audience should be familiar with these spaces if they're listening. But maybe they're not quite sure how some of these pieces sort of operate or fit together or work together. So your firm's sort of the central point. Can you maybe give us a broad overview of how that?
So KIX overall, it has 3 big parts. It has a means of networking across people who are working in today's education system. So these are 4 regional hubs, and they bring together people who work in education, whether the ministry or people in associated NGOs or teachers unions or bilateral development partners. And those people come together for peer learning and exchange, where people from one country can share what's happening, maybe a policy reform or some new initiative that they're trying, maybe some experience that they've just had that they think is really promising, and the hubs provide a mechanism for that to be shared with their neighbors who probably are dealing with some very similar challenges. So there's peer learning and exchange that happens in the regional hubs. The regional hubs also facilitate knowledge synthesis and consideration of existing evidence. So there's a big push on knowledge mobilization within the regional hubs. And they also very much listen to what are the priorities of these different countries. And they then communicate back to us centrally within IDRC to inform the second part of KIX. So if the first part of KIX is the regional hubs, the second part is the applied research that we fund. So we fund applied research on the topics that have bubbled up from the regional hubs as being the top priorities of today's education systems. And from there, we define what are those knowledge gaps, what are the innovation gaps that could address some of those challenges. And then we fund applied research in those very same countries to meet those needs. And so that second part is we fund now a set of 40 different research projects that are on some of the key topics that have surfaced through the hubs. So that includes things like teacher professional development, distance education, a lot of equity issues in education, sometimes on data systems and how to support better use of data to inform education policy and implementation. So a whole raft of projects with a strong focus on gender equality. So those are the topics that we fund applied research, and they come from, the topics come from the hubs. And then the third part of KIX is just starting now, where, having had about 3 years of experience, we've heard that there's interest in perhaps KIX meeting more directly evidence for policy in individual countries. So while we started with a lot of inter-country knowledge exchange and that being the focus, there's now sort of more of a pull to provide more direct connections in with individual countries on their key policy priorities linked to, education sector plan development or actual funding processes within the Global Partnership for Education. So that's the third part of KIX that now has come online. And they're connected because, again, the topics for the country support are coming through the hubs. And so hubs are really the key part of KIX that inform then what happens in the research and what will happen through the country support. And of course, then what develops through the research is fed back into the hubs. And so some of the projects that we support, where there's a good alignment between what they're finding and the ongoing topics of conversation within the hubs, then the research that we're funding is sometimes able to feed right back in to the hub activities. So I'm talking to, a particular strategy of the Europe Asia Pacific Hub, one of the 4. And the people who are on this, who are listening, may be aware, for instance, of the learning cycles that the Europe Asia Pacific Hub has facilitated. In fact, I think one of your previous guests, a couple of them probably, have been involved in running some of those learning cycles. And so that's the kind of connections that we're trying to support through the interconnections between the different parts of KIX.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Gives us quite an overview. We might have our own little space within this broader network, but really understanding how it works and how people are able to sort of carry the giant weight of just sort of passing around research and practices and coming together. Yeah, so that's we definitely love to hear that. So thank you for that answer. The previous question was kind of the bigger picture, which you answered wonderfully. But how about for you individually? I mean, you're the program leader. What does like a day to day for you look like other than sort of hopping on podcast and things like that? What do you kind of do on a day to day when you're at the IDRC?
You hear a question like that, and my first reaction is, oh, people are going to think my job is so boring. But I'll start with, I love my job. And then I think, the people who are listening are also people who work in education systems or in, development partners or NGOs or maybe in universities. And all of them probably also are working in some form of a bureaucracy. And so I'm happy to tell you what my week was like. And I hope that might be somehow interesting to other people, because I will start with, I do love my job. And of course, a big part of it is that I get to work with a team of thoughtful, kind, committed people, both within IDRC, but then in the larger sets of the organizations that run the regional hubs and the research projects that we work with. We get to work with people who are all about research, which means that they are driven by questions, and they organize their work and their life by answering questions and exploring. So, we're working with curious people who are open-minded and interesting. So the framing is, yes, I work in a bureaucracy, but I get to work on interesting issues with interesting people who are open-minded and curious. So it's a great context. But yeah, what did my week work like? I'll say that right now we are in a marvelous moment in KIX where the research projects and the hubs have been ongoing now for a couple of years, and they are either in full swing, or in some cases the research projects are coming toward maturity, which means that there's a lot of outputs that are coming. A lot of research findings are going to be consolidated in the next 6 months or so by the end of this year. And so there's a lot of movement and a lot of consolidation of what we're learning. But at the same time, we have been approved to be able to extend KIX's lifespan from its original end date in 2024 all the way to 2027, which means that we can start to even launch new things that have that longer time horizon. So we are in the midst of having both the ongoing programming and ramping up the implementation of this extension. So a huge part of my week was actually organizing our first call for proposals under the extension. Which by the time people are listening to this podcast is probably going to be live or already done. And it's got a focus on data systems and data use. And so the work of that in terms of the bureaucracy is that we needed to listen again for an updated articulation of what the issues are with respect to data use, data systems, data quality. And so there was a stock taking of what the current issues are in Europe, Asia Pacific, and the 2 Africa regions, to hear how that has maybe changed a little bit in the last couple of years, and what should we be now funding applied research on. So we did the scoping study, which was going back and listening to what the country priorities were and turning that into a call for proposals. And on the other part of that, there's a whole lot of needing to have your websites up to date, the comm strategy, all the details about who can apply, a lot of the legal and administrative issues that you need to work out in advance, so that it's clear to applicants. And so mobilizing a call for proposals is something that we do in IDRC, and we are very busy with that this week, launching our first call. And at the same time, we are finalizing plans for all 4 regional hubs so that they can continue their work till 2027. And that was built on a lot of experience to date them having been operational now for 3 years and really listening a lot to what is meeting needs and how things should evolve and adapt for the next couple of years. Within the EAP region, there was a really productive meeting in January where there was a representative of each of the countries who were able to come together, think about the experience to date, the results to date, and where do they want to go, and their thoughts informed the plans for the EAP region going forward. So this is a very consultative, deliberative sort of process, and we are now in the process of just finalizing some of the administration of that so that that can all actually happen in the next couple of years. So those are two big things, a call for proposals and continuing the hubs. But then there's also all of these research projects that we've been supporting for the last couple of years. There's a number of cross-cutting themes, and we want to support those projects individually so that they're useful in the context in which they're happening, but then also look across on some of the common issues so that we can draw together some synthetic learning across, because they're all working on really particular issues in very particular contexts, but sometimes there's some learning that we can do across. And so there are 4 of them that are happening. One of them is on out-of-school children, and maybe I could just explain that one a bit more. There's since 2010, there's not been a whole lot of movement in improvement in the number of children who are out of school. It's actually kind of stagnated. And during COVID, of course, the disruption to the education system meant that there were so many children that coming back into school or, at risk of dropping out has just, it's been under even increasing pressure. So there are a lot of initiatives that are around trying to figure out how can you reach children who are out of school, and maybe just jumping back into grade level isn't going to be the answer. Maybe they need some sort of an alternative education program or an accelerated education program so that they can either get some of their foundational skills or catch up to grade level in a shorter period of time and either get back into education or maybe in some cases into technical vocational training or something else. So there's a lot of experiences of these out of school initiatives, but they tend to be isolated because they are reaching children who are vulnerable and maybe in different pockets. And so we've got a set of 4 different projects that are all working on different aspects of educational options for children who are out of school. And so now we've commissioned a synthesis to look across so that they can collaborate with one another to reveal maybe some of the similar issues, maybe some similar findings. And they all have a focus on how do you ensure quality education in those programs, but how do you scale their impact? Because again, a lot of them are quite isolated, small initiatives, but how do you help them either link in to the national education system, or how do you scale their impact where they are so that they can reach more of these sets of vulnerable learners? So that's one example of the synthesis that we're doing on an ongoing basis, and that's also part of my week. So there's a whole lot of that in terms of the programming, and then maybe I'll name one more part of my job, which is the coordination aspect with other initiatives. So KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education, and it's really important that we connect in with what GPE is doing and be the evidence arm for the global partnership. And so there's a lot of coordination that we do with GPE and GPE processes, but also other major industrial initiatives on education and research. And so there's a group of donors and multilaterals who meet together regularly to ensure harmonization of efforts, to look at issues of quality across or learning across. And so this week included another online meeting of some of these initiatives who are trying to figure out what can we learn about really supporting knowledge uptake from evidence in education systems and supporting Southern research in this space. So that's another part of what my week was.
Yeah, you just I just prompted like a thought or a question. The IDRC is part of the Canadian government, and so I guess I'm curious about you talked about going to the donors and saying, hey, here's the evidence. Is there that too for the Canadian government? Do you have to go and say, hey, here's what we're doing. Hey, can we extend this project? Here's why. What does kind of that look like, I guess, for the organization?
Well, yeah, so maybe I should explain. So IDRC it's an agency of the Canadian government. It's been around for about 50 some years, with a mandate to support research on a range of different topics, and education is one, but also on climate change or social and political development, on agriculture, on lots of different issues. So yes, as an agency of the Canadian government, we are part of the Canadian government apparatus. And Canada also has education priorities. And one of them is building the evidence base on things like education for refugees and displaced populations and host communities. So we have a lot of a connection with the people who are working on that and the work that we support on those similar topics, where there is, let's say, a project that we're supporting on scaling the impact of educational technologies for foundational skills in refugee and displaced populations, and how those can, merge with the curriculum, how those can be supported through teacher training, how that can work technically as well as, kind of systemically. And so that's something where we want to share back and forth, because it's a key interest of the Canadian government, but also, something that we're working on that feeds back and forth. So yeah, there are ways of connecting in with the larger Canadian priorities.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful. Maybe we can talk a little bit more specifically about some of the research you supported. You mentioned kind of gender equality is weaved throughout some, all these different kinds of issues. Why is that area maybe so important to you or to the organization? And maybe, what are some success stories, if you can share some that you've kind of witnessed? And then maybe, of course, we still have work to do. So, what are the challenges that lie ahead?
Absolutely. So maybe I'll just start with, what is this research that we're funding? Because of course, research is of many types, and we do only a particular type within IDRC and within KIX. So the kind of research that we're talking about is very applied and engaged research. And so the research that we fund is sort of problem-focused, solution-oriented, and very much connected with the people who are working today in education systems. So if there's a research project that we have on teacher professional development, that project is going to be engaging with teachers, with people in the ministry, maybe with the teacher training initiatives of the governments involved, so that whatever the research is relevant, engaged, and useful, and in some cases co-created by the people who are in the education system today. And the research is not just to come up with new ideas or new findings, but it also connects straight into, hey, if there's a better way of doing teacher training, it actually is informing teacher training modules, or a peer learning and mentoring support system that's being integrated into a platform that's being offered. So the knowledge mobilization is built into what we call a research project. It's got to include knowledge generation, that you find out new things, and you answer research questions, but it also is always connected with capacity strengthening, so that research and evidence can get used, and also probably connecting in with policy and programs, so that there is a pretty direct relevance and maybe even uptake into policy and practice. So that's a three-part aspect of what we're trying to do in the research that we fund, this applied and engaged research. And then within KIX, we have a very particular set of questions that we tend to focus on. So again, there's a lot of different types of research, a lot of longitudinal studies, or really understanding a problem. But we've decided in KIX that our research is going to focus on a challenge within education systems, let's say helping ensure the educational success of marginalized girls, as an example. And then focuses on things that we already know work. So promising or proven innovative approaches to address those challenges. And then the research questions are, how can that get scaled? Because there's all kinds of really cool pilot projects, and there's a lot of funding for new initiatives and innovative, development and that kind of thing. But we felt like there's a lot of the knowledge gaps exist on, yes, something works, but what does it take to work at scale? Or how do you help institutionalize some things that work? in fact, a lot of really great ideas, when they're supposed to just get taken up into, let's say, government systems, there can be a washout of the effect because the figuring out how to bolt it into a system was sort of handed over without a lot of research behind it. And so we've decided within KIX that that's going to be the place where we stick the research questions. It's what are the promising and proven approaches? And then the questions are around, how does that need to be adapted to different national contexts? What does it take to scale that? What are the issues when you try to scale something? So that's the nature of the research that we fund. And it's on a lot of different topics, but you asked me about gender equality. So why don't I give you a gender equality example? Because certainly gender equality is going to be woven into anything that we fund, because anything we fund is about people. And one of the aspects of people is that we are gendered people. And you really need to pay attention to gender differences in whatever topic you're focused on. But I'll talk about an example that's very much focused on gender equality front and center as what it's trying to do. So there are definitely issues in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of female retention and completion rates of school, particularly of secondary school. And there is a proven approach that has been developed by an organization called CAMFED, called the Learner Guide Program. And it's an approach that was developed through an NGO of the learner guides are actually people. It's not a written guide, but girls who have completed secondary school, who are supported to become mentors to other girls who are still in school and vulnerable learners, to try to help them stay in school, try to help them, achieve success that way, and think about life skills and moving on. And there's a development of there was a curriculum that was developed through this program too, called My Better World, which is, about positive gender norms and about life skills training. And it's a complement to the academic curriculum of a high school program. And so this initiative got KIX funding because they had particular questions, not around whether it works or not, or whether it works as an NGO program, but because there were governments that were interested in actually integrating this as part of the secondary school curriculum and approach. And they knew that it doesn't just happen that you can hand something over. You actually need to support it with evidence. And so this project is happening in 3 different countries, in Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, which is only some of the countries that use the Learner Guide program of CAMFED. And it's built as a research project because in Tanzania, the government had already said that they wanted to take this on as part of the Tanzanian approach in secondary school, and they were already committed to trialing it in a number of different schools. And so the research project is actually testing its efficacy and how it needs to be adapted in order for it to actually live as a government program, and comparing that to its ongoing efficacy as an NGO-run program connected into schools. So this is something where already the commitment to scale happened before the project, and so the project is coming along, building evidence to support that implementation at scale and a further scaling within Tanzania. In Zambia, there was an interest, and the NGO-run activity had been going on, but it had not really been bolted into the secondary school system yet in Zambia. And so in the context of the project, there was a lot of focus now on what needs to change for it to now become part of the Zambian secondary school approach, which is not the same as Tanzania, and supporting people from Zambia to come and learn from the Tanzania program. So that intercountry learning is also built into this research project. And so that's the focus of that type of scaling-oriented research, of something that is fundamentally designed to support something that already works, to improve gender equality and gendered outcomes of secondary school in a couple of different countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, we love to hear that sort of south to south kind of learning. These places regionally kind of learning from each other, where it's not just somebody coming in from the United States or Canada and saying, "Hey, we do this over here. Why don't you do that?" So that's a really wonderful message. I think for our audience, appreciate that. We're kind of coming to the end of the interview, and I always like to kind of ask the guest if they can maybe give some words of wisdom to our audience out there, and specifically for you. You work in this central space, bringing different actors and stakeholders together, whether it's sort of the donors that have sort of this international view, maybe the policymakers who have sort of like domestic political issues to think about, local practitioners that are stretched very thin, trying to do everything that they can, and then maybe egghead academics like myself, to come in out of the ivory tower. So how do you work with all these various stakeholders? What are what are some advice maybe on how to do this well?
Maybe I can say what I'm pleased about and what I see takes some effort.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd say within KIX, from an IDRC vantage point, one of the things that I find most exciting is being able to devise a research agenda based on the needs of today's actors in education systems. So basically defining a research agenda based on the priorities of the users of research, like the intended users. And that's not necessarily easy to do because a lot of times research agendas are built by academics, on basis of where does this, existing research pointing us to, future directions or gaps in the literature. And that's all good and important. And but within KIX, because it's a mechanism of the Global Partnership for Education, which is like an international financing platform, for funding today's education systems, the very interesting opportunity that I think KIX has that I feel great about from a funding agency of research is being able to devise that research agenda on the basis of the articulated needs and priorities of those who are working today in education. And so it just feels like that is a way of ensuring relevance that I feel quite is grounded, and I feel quite solid that yes, if we're going to be funding research on this, it could very well, have more possibility of being linked and really applicable to make improvements quickly in education systems. I mean, it always takes time for research to develop. Quickly is not 2 months. Quickly is still a 3-year research project, but still, I hope that the relevance is there and the engagement from the front end of defining the research priorities all the way through the engagement of all these projects would actually mean that this is relevant and useful, because that's really what we're about. So, what's the learning there is, I guess, always learning about how can you listen to your end users? How can you listen to these different stakeholders? And what are the mechanisms that need to be there to listen? And so in KIX, the listening mechanism is fundamentally these regional hubs. And so, we're always building in that iterative listening and adapting. And maybe the other part that I think about is we sort of assume a lot of coordination just happens. But coordination actually needs to be resourced. It's got to be somebody's job. And so again, if I think about the way that we structure our research projects, we try to really emphasize that knowledge mobilization is actually a huge part of a research project. And so then, you think about the different folks that you mentioned, when you asked me this question, to communicate to researchers that the knowledge mobilization aspect is actually probably as important to us as the new research, and that synthesizing, packaging up, translating evidence to different kinds of users, making it timely for them, maybe adjusting what you think is the most important thing to research on the basis of their needs, not the basis of, just the question as you defined it. That flexibility and responsiveness being able to be built into research projects and their knowledge mobilization strategies, I think is also a key learning. Maybe I'll just give one example. When you do kind of real world research for policymakers or people who do implementation, they might have different questions than the researchers. Maybe the researchers are primarily thinking about, does this thing work, or how can we develop a great initiative that really supports learning outcomes? So that's great. But if you're a policymaker, you probably need to really understand, what does that cost? What are the key cost drivers? How do you do a cost analysis? How do we understand cost at different scales? At a kind of a pilot scale or a small scale compared to a large scale, those costs are going to change. So it could be that because you're really listening to the priorities and the way that your research users are asking questions, maybe you need to build that then into your research project in a different way. So I think what are we learning is it's really being open to the perspectives and the questions of the folks that you're intending to serve through your research. and understanding that that's going to require flexibility and maybe building in different kinds of relationships and networking and engagement.
Great. Well, what a message for the audience out there. Really appreciate it. And Tricia, thank you for joining me on the podcast. This has been a wonderful conversation. And this concludes our KIX EAP podcast, which is released every first Wednesday of the month. Of course, the opinions expressed on the KIX EAP podcast are solely those of the host and the guest. The KIX EAP podcast is made possible by KIX, which stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education. Globally, KIX is administered by the International Development Research Center in Canada. NORAG in Geneva hosts one of the 4 regional hubs of KIX. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast episodes. Thanks for listening.